Vintage Audio Attic, Repair and Restoration. This video shows the repair and restoration of a Sony TA-F6B integrated amplifier. This integrated amplifier, it's in pretty good shape, but it's in need of some repair and restoration. When I powered up this Sony TA-F6B, there was a slight clicking sound, but no other indication that the unit was on. I removed the top cover just to take a closer look, just to see what I could see. The power supply in this unit has a reputation of failing. You know, it's 40 years old, it runs on the warm side, and it just has a reputation of causing some troubles. So that's in the top left corner. You can kind of see something, looks like a bunch of screws, and it's with a cover. So I went ahead and I removed that cover, which is where the power supply resides, and you know, again, just took a look. You can see with this all sealed up how this probably gets very, very warm. This is an unusual design for a solid-state vintage amplifier, as it produces over 300 volts DC. That's very unusual. In a tube amplifier, that would be quite normal, but not in a solid state. So I removed it and then took a look, and just with my eyes, I could see that there was an area where a transistor and capacitor, you know, you could tell obvious damage, and there was a piece of artwork that was just blown right off the bottom of the board. So almost certainly both the transistor and capacitor did not fail at the same time. One component failed and took the other one out. And if you're guessing, a 40-year-old electrolytic capacitor is probably what went. And this is a prime example of one component going that's old and should have been replaced. And, you know, it went, and it probably took the transistor out with it. Once I repaired the artwork and I replaced the defective transistor and capacitor, you know, the amp, it powered up just fine. So at that point, I was going to continue on. Well, first I checked the voltages out of the power supply, made sure it actually was working, and seemed to be, I had the proper voltages. So then I continued on with the repair and the restoration. I removed the faceplate and the knobs for cleaning, as well to allow me access to the switches and pots in the unit. With the boards removed, you know, it's a great time to clean up the chassis. You can get to spots that, you know, haven't been cleaned since it was new. So, I mean, you know, there's always a lot of cleaning with any vintage repair or restoration. With the boards removed, it's so much easier to clean the pots and switches with deoxit. You can get the deoxit into the switches and the pots, and make sure you don't get it all over the place. You know, deoxit's a great product, but it'll make a mess if you spray it all over. So with these boards removed, I can get the deoxit where I need to and clean them properly. One great thing about this Sony TA-F6B is the slack in the cables. I'm not sure if I've ever worked on a unit that has this much slack in the cables. I mean, that's a great thing, you know, because these were wired up in a way that was the norm for commercial equipment or consumer equipment like this is in the 70s and into the 80s. They used a wire wrap gun, and they hardwired these wires to each of the assemblies. So sometimes you have trouble with that because there's not enough slack to move them around like you'd like to. So that wasn't the case in this issue. And the front also tilts down, so that was nice. And there's just a lot of room to be able to get in there and work, you know, and that always makes it much easier. So, you know, I could have the chassis on one side of the table, and boy, I had enough room to bring these assemblies right on to the other side and be able to work on them. I'll be replacing all of the old electrolytic capacitors with modern equivalents. This unit had a lot of Nishnakon capacitors when it was manufactured 40 years ago, and I'll be replacing them with a lot of Nishnakon. I'll also be replacing many of the smaller value electrolytic capacitors that are in the audio path with film capacitors, and this will allow for improved audio quality. The replacement capacitors are smaller in physical size than the originals. In addition, I'll be using higher temperature rated capacitors than were in it to begin with. They were all 85 centigrade capacitors, and I'll be replacing them with 105 degree rated capacitors, and 105 degrees centigrade is 221 degrees Fahrenheit, so hopefully your amp doesn't get that hot, but gives it a little room there of a margin of error. The replacement filter capacitors are about half the physical size of the originals, but notice the 200 volt rating on these capacitors. That's again very unusual for solid state equipment. Usually you'd have something, you know, from 50 to 100 volt ratings for filter capacitors, but these are 200 volt. Again, this is a great unit to work on because once you get everything removed, there's just a lot of space to work. You can get to the artwork side of these assemblies, so you can replace components. You got to get over there so you can get the components in and out easily. And again, this unit makes that pretty easy. Here I've replaced the old electrolytic capacitors on the EQ board. Hopefully, you won't have to get in here for another 40 years and replace them again. Again, I can't tell you how much easier it is that these just lean however you want them. You have to cut a few tie wraps, but once you get those tie wraps cut, all these assemblies come right on out and makes cleaning up everything so much easier in the chassis. And as I said, it just makes component changing much easier too. Well, I've replaced the necessary components in the control assembly, and I'll put that back into the chassis. Next comes in the EQ assembly that, again, I upgraded the components and it's ready to get put back in. Getting closer here to completion. This is just something that needs to be done on any 40-year-old piece of vintage audio equipment. Several different assemblies here, but again, you can see I can just pull it right on out, and I've got enough room to work. This is the meter assembly, and once again, it was easy to get to, and clean the switch up and change out those components. Next, I'll do electrolytic capacitor replacement on the power amp assembly. Again, not too difficult to get out. The rear panel tilts down also, so this makes, again, the whole case just sort of sandwiches open, so that makes it much easier. You just remove 4 screws on the power assembly, and I've positioned it on its side so I can get to it. Get to the artwork side so I can replace those 40-year-old capacitors. Once again, this unit will just kind of unfold for you, and there's a lot of room in the cables, and makes just any repair or restoration much easier. I'm going to reseat the power transistors with new insulators and new thermal compound. You just remove 2 screws, and they'll pull right on out of the sockets. You clean up the heat sink, and then, as I said, you put new insulators and thermal compound. The original transistors are still in this unit, so doing this will help those run cool, and hopefully they'll last another 40 years, and there's probably no reason that they can't. So once doing that work, I've put the power assembly back power amplifier assembly back into the amplifier, and I'll reinstall everything. Now I'll go, can't forget about that power supply, right? I got it going initially to get the unit going, but now it's time to get rid of those electrolytic capacitors that are within the power supply itself. Again, in the power supply, I'll be using Nishinikon PW series capacitors, and they're 105 degree centigrade rated capacitor, and they have a great reputation, and they work very well in any vintage audio power supply. So I've got the capacitors replaced, and I'm getting closer here. So I've reinstalled the power supply, and I've gotten the other boards installed. And then once you're done here, you got to wrap everything back up and give it a quick visual check because the whole unit's been apart. And then it'll be time for some bench testing. So, you know, like I said, dress up the cables neatly, install new tie wraps, and she's ready for the test bench. First thing you do whenever working on a unit or just have it in to check it is adjust the DC offset, you know, to factory specifications. And again, like any unit, you need to have the service manual to tell you where to hook up your leads so that you can adjust that into what the specification is for that particular unit. I'll use a signal generator along with a distortion analyzer to test out the amp, make sure all the work I've done is legit, and that I've already listened to it a little bit with my ears, and I think it sounds good. But really, whenever you do this type of work, you need to have the test equipment available to validate that. You know, tested out very good on the test bench. No issues at all. I left it running for a couple hours. So I think we're about to wrap it up. So this Sony TA F6B integrated amplifier repair and restoration is complete. It's time for some music. Okay, I'm getting ready to move in my Sony TA F6B integrated amplifier, and it hasn't been in the system in a little while. I'm looking forward to listening to it again, so here we go. I've got my speakers hooked up, and my turntable, CD player, tape decks, etc. And it's about time to power on my TA F6B and run it through its paces, so here we go. Alright, I heard the speaker relay, and that's always a good sign, so I think she's alive and ready to make some music. Visit VintageAudioAddict.com for more repair and restoration tips on your vintage audio equipment.